Good evening. Wow, this is always so magical when you have adults rather than students, that actually there's this sort of quiet that descends without you even having to look sternly. Welcome. I'm really pleased to welcome you tonight to our Askwith Forum and plenary session for the Association for Moral Education Conference. This is a real honor and a real pleasure to be here for it. I'm really excited to introduce our expert panelists, but before I do, I want to highlight that this is our combined event with the Askwith Forum, which is a series that is held by the Harvard Graduate School of Education. They feature a wide range of topics and invite leaders in their fields to address the highest priority challenges facing education, both in the United States and abroad. There's a new series this year that's part of the Askwith forums called The Debates, which address key controversies in education, and we hope model the ways in which civil disagreement can promote deeper understanding, which is an idea that many of you in the audience are committed to as part of the Association for Moral Education, which is one of the focuses of the conference, but also something that we know is a real challenge at all times and in this time. These Askwith forums help to strengthen the intellectual life of the school through conversation, debate, and the exchange of ideas. They're also a way to open our doors to welcome members of the greater Harvard community and the general public, and we're really grateful to the Harvard Graduate School of Education for welcoming all of us with the Association of Moral Education into the Askwith Forum and to do this combined event. We are also live streaming this event, as we do for all Askwith Fora. This is on Facebook Live and YouTube Live, in addition to being live streamed into our overflow rooms. And we will encourage you to participate if you are viewing this online rather than here physically with us in Cambridge. One way to participate when we get to the question section is by sending questions by Twitter. You can use the hashtag Askwith, ASKWITH, or the hashtag for the conference, AME16. Okay, and we will have somebody who is able to transmit your questions to us. So tonight, we are discussing the question about what makes for a good citizen. And this is a question that many of us have been thinking about for many years, and which, for better or worse, feels much more salient to many others of us in these days, in 2016, than it perhaps had for a while. It's gained salience for people around the world as we've looked at really surprising civic events. Again, perhaps, we can start it very recently from the Brexit vote in the UK, right, last year. Trump's election in the United States this year, Duterte's election in the Philippines, the shifts going on in Poland from a democratic to an increasingly non-democratic country. As we see the most recent referendum vote, the constitutional vote in Italy, we've seen also the collapse of economic institutions and potentially of state institutions in Venezuela. We have shifting political alliances in Asia and Africa. We think about the challenges of the South Korean prime minister. Actually, I have not been following the news in the last 24 hours. Has she resigned yet? I'm actually not sure. But so we are in a world of very quickly shifting politics, and that's though at the national level, informal government, right? We are also though in an era of very quickly shifting civic politics at the much more local level, and perhaps paradoxically, at the much more global level, right? Because in part of the affordances of new digital media, as well as the globalization of discourse and of organizing and of activism, as well as the particularization and the localization also of discourse and activism and action. We are at an era where there's a ton of work being done and hence shifting possibilities in terms of what's happening in civil society, in what Ethan Zuckerberg earlier today at the former plenary called insurrectionist politics, right? And at work being done by people young and old, by legal citizens and non-citizens alike, by people with formal documented status and informal undocumented status, trying to change the world around them for the better from their perspectives, and sometimes for the worse from other people's perspectives, and trying to figure out how we navigate this world as citizens in the very broad sense ourselves. So citizens meaning not only legal citizens of a country or a municipality, et cetera, but as people with civic rights and responsibilities and a civic role to play in collective action with others, but also as we think about how we relate to others who play these civic roles and have these civic responsibilities, our family members, our friends, our colleagues, our children, people who live or work in similar areas to us, people who live and work and believe in communities that are very, very different from us, and how we navigate across boundaries and within communities in order to try to create civic change, confront the civic change that others are creating, and determine what we are excited about and what kinds of change we embrace, what we are afraid of, and whether those fears are justified or not, and how we respond, what excites us and what concerns us, who we are concerned to protect, and who to what extent our urge to protect is a sign of, say, a sense of moral obligation versus, say, a colonial sense or some kind of savior sense, and how we navigate around that. These are all questions that we are all confronting as civic actors now, and many of us in our work are trying to help others confront as civic actors and now or in the future. And so for that reason, I am really, really excited that we have this forum tonight with three really sort of top people in their respective fields to help us talk through this. So let me introduce them quickly. The first person who will speak is Kawashima Ginsburg. She is the director of the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, which probably most of you know as CIRCLE at civicyouth.org, at the Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts University. CIRCLE's research on youth civic learning and engagement reaches a wide range of audiences through outlets such as the New York Times, NPR, Vox, C-SPAN, and NBC, as well as The Guardian and the BBC. And sort of, I realize that we have sort of local U.S. networks, but especially in times of high civic ferment, their research and work gets used around the world, including their 2016 Millennial Poll Analysis, which is a pre-election survey of young voters, and then their young voters in the 2016 general election, which is their exit poll, and they currently have a post-election survey in the field looking also at young voters and youth who are citizens, whether or not they voted. Before coming to CIRCLE, Kay worked directly with marginalized youth in Chicago, both within a public high school as an evaluator for a dropout prevention program, and as a clinician working with diverse youth and their families. She earned her PhD in clinical psychology with specialization in family and children from Loyola University in Chicago, and we're really excited to have her here. Next, we're going to hear from Callie Crossley, who is the host of Under the Radar with Callie Crossley, which airs on WGBH 89.7 FM, which is a very familiar radio station to those of us here in Boston, but also can be heard again around the world at WGBH.org. And she's also a featured panelist on WGBH's Beat the Press on TV. She's a frequent commentator on television and radio programs and the recipient of many prizes for her work. She earned an Oscar nomination, a National Emmy, and the Alfred I. DuPont Columbia Award for Eyes on the Prize, America's Civil Rights Years, which my guess is many of you have seen and used in your classrooms, for those of you who are educators, as I did. She won the 2016 Best Commentary Award from the Public Radio News Directors Organization for Tomorrow Is Not Promised, Life After Hurricane Katrina, and was awarded both the 2015 and 2016 National Association of Black Journalists Salute to Excellence Awards for a compilation of commentaries, Observation on Ferguson, America's Racial Ground Zero, and Race Matters, Echoing History. Callie Crossley received her BA in English from Wellesley College and holds an honorary doctorate Doctor of Arts from Pine Manor College and a Cambridge College Honorary Doctorate of Humane Letters. And she has 2 Harvard fellowships from the Nieman Foundation and also the Institute of Politics at the Kennedy School. And then finally, we'll hear from Michelle Fine, who's a distinguished professor of critical psychology, women's studies, American studies, and urban education at the Graduate Center at City University of New York. She's a pioneer in the field of youth participatory action research and has been involved in studies with participants across racial, ethnic, and social class backgrounds to investigate circuits of dispossession and circuits of critical resistance. She has so many books that she's written. I said to her, Michelle, which ones do you want me to mention? If I were to name just the books that I have used with my own students and in my own work, it would go on for a while. So she has 2 books that we sort of agreed that I would mention that are more recent: Charter Schools and the Corporate Takeover of Public Education, and Changing Minds, The Impact of College and Prison on Women in a Maximum Security Prison. This latter book was written by 7 women who are currently incarcerated, along with 7 researchers from CUNY Graduate Center. And then her most recent book, her forthcoming book, which is coming out next year from Teachers College Press, is Just Methods in Revolting Times, which certainly sounds timely. So the way we're going to do this is we will hear from each of the panelists for about 7 or 8 minutes in response to a set of questions, which I am about to pose. After that, I will moderate a discussion probably for about 20 minutes. And then we will open it up to a conversation with you all. And at that point, you will be invited to come up and ask questions at one of the 2 microphones. And as a reminder, if you would like to pose questions, if you are remote, you can send it in with hashtag Askwith or hashtag AME16. And so let me just pose the questions that I asked them to respond to, although I will say that I have also invited them to sort of, riff on whatever they would like to talk about. But the questions that I think first came to mind when I was thinking about the title of this forum on what makes a good citizen and how do you create one, are in light of both national and global events, how do you think about the meaning and construction of citizenship these days? What's required to be a good citizen? And how do good citizens come to life? Of course, once you start talking about good citizens, then there's a who question. Who counts as a good citizen? And why? And by whom, right? Who gets to decide who counts as a good citizen? And how are civic identities, actions, and membership constructed, enacted, and challenged in these turbulent times? So with that, I'm going to sit down, and I will hand it over to Kay to get us started. Thank you very much.
Good evening. Thank you so much for having me here. It's such an honor to be with such great thinkers and great minds and all of you. I really look forward to talking about this more with more questions. My job as a director of a Center for Civic Learning and Engagement, in a way, is to think about citizenship. How do we define it? How do we create good citizenship? But tonight, I actually wanted to start with telling you my personal story, because I've been really finding myself thinking about it over and over based on what's been happening for the past year or so to myself personally, and I think outside of myself, socially and politically. So many of you may not know this, because I don't know you, most of you, but after being here in the United States as a student and then a green card holder, I naturalized to be a US citizen earlier this year, just this year. And I had the pleasure of being the first-time voter in this really interesting election cycle. But on top of that, there was some really concrete change in my legal status, as you can tell. There is literally a citizenship paper that I needed to use in order to get my US passport, and I now have access to things like serving as a jury and voting and even working in federal offices in some ways. So there was this concrete change. In the meantime, my job hasn't changed one bit. My commitment to citizenship and democracy has hopefully been steadfast this whole time. And what I do as a personal citizen, aside from the fact that I did vote twice, primary and general, haven't really changed at all. But on the other hand, I have been questioned more times than ever in regards to the legitimacy of my citizenship. I had my first full body pad check earlier this year, back into this country. And then in just the month of October, when I was just trying to fly domestically, I was told that maybe I shouldn't fly because of my last name, which is really hard to read and pronounce. And it only stopped after I started carrying my US passport as my credential instead of my Massachusetts driver's license. I'm telling you this story because it's really interesting to think about sort of me, who internally haven't changed at all. I haven't even changed what I do as a citizen. I generally think of myself as a pretty good citizen, not a maybe stand-up one, but pretty good one. In the meantime, though, how I'm viewed by the external bodies, whether it's the government or just a security officer at the airport or just somebody that I run into the street, have really been shifting. Just like sand under my feet in some ways. It's been really fluid. So these experiences, this mix of citizenship as legitimate status or somebody that has or triggers skepticism has really led me to question what it means to be a good citizen and what it means at different times and how to define it. So I'm finding that the sort of identity labels like I'm an Asian American or I'm a Japanese person or I'm a Japanese American person or my legal or my citizen, those things have really strong limitations on what I do or how I really see myself. So that doesn't really take me anywhere. It also doesn't really take me too far to think about what I do in terms of activities, because clearly, depending on the political and social and historical background of what I do, anything can be a citizenship, anything can be civic engagement, but whether that's good for the society, as in the definition of good citizenship, can change depending on who judges that. So I've been really questioning myself, and I can say that I'm somewhat in flux in some ways. So what I'm really trying to today to do is really to think about what is a good citizenship when it comes down to things I can change, things I think we can teach our young people, and then what else we need to do after that. So I'll start with sort of what I broke down as sort of an internal construct or tools for good citizenship that I think we should all try to equip ourselves with. First is radical skepticism, including for our own views, what we think is facts, what we believe to be true. An appetite for different perspectives and alternative explanations. Again, even if we're confident. Ability to sit with and learn from dissent and people that disagree with you, and even the experience of feeling offended or assaulted even by challenge to our own worldviews. And then empathy for those who disagree. And it's not a directive or encouragement even to feel sympathy for somebody that disagrees with you or really you think are really wrong. But it's just empathy as in cognitive understanding of where somebody might come from, how they might have gotten to that conclusion. I also think we need to really have that or get back the direct ties with people that are different from us, politically, socially, educationally, racially, religiously, all kinds of ways. But direct ties is really important. And then importantly, and Callie, I'm sure you'll talk about this, the skills for really combing through the sea of information, vetting them, and then selecting what's relevant for what we need to learn and what we need to do. And finally, I think understanding the central principles that drive us to understand who we are as citizens, why we think we're a good citizen or not, and what kind of decisions we make based on those central principles. Now, it's great to sort of think about these skills, and those are, of course, up to debate, because I really endorse the idea of dissent. But the question really is, can we make that happen for all young people, not just in the United States, but everywhere? And are these good everywhere? Those are all up for question, but at least in the United States, if we don't have a way to make sure all of the citizens, broadly defined, have these skills and tools, those are no good. In some ways, they'll just expand the gaps we've had forever in what we learn, what we can do, who has power, who makes judgment about who the good citizens are, and how do we define good citizenship. So I think, in a way, we also need to think about what do we need to do as caring, committed, and competent citizens to move bigger needles together? How do we change the systems and codes by which those systems operate in order to make sure that we are equitably distributing these opportunities to acquire these tools? And I think that is a bigger question for another day, perhaps, but I'll stop here.
Great. Thank you so much.
So I'll admit to having many random thoughts about all of this because it seemed like a very big question on many levels. But the first thing that came to mind when asked to speak about this was a play by acclaimed and now deceased playwright August Wilson. His play is called The Gem of the Ocean, one of the plays, and in it he has a character named Citizen Barlow. And there is an exchange between characters in that play in which one of the characters says, "What's your name?" He says, "My name is Citizen." And he says, "Well, why?" He says, "Well, my mother named me this so there would be no question that I would be able to have all of the rights of a citizen of this country." This was one of the plays that August Wilson was using to look at the life of African Americans through the 20th century. And he wanted to explore in that play ancestry and the path that many African Americans have had to take of resistance and persistence to become fully recognized citizens. So when I thought about that, then I realized that I guess all in my life I realized that it's been, I'm dealing with assumptions about my citizenship, but more about assumptions about how I'm not a citizen to many people. It's always a challenge to it in some way all through my life. Kay mentioned the media, and I grew up with a mother who instilled in me and my sister, my father too, we were all big news consumers. But my mother was very clear that the news that we consumed from the quote-unquote mainstream media was really not the whole story. So I knew that long before we were talking about mainstream, other kinds of stories. Because she said the assumptions made, and my father, of course, agreed, in those stories about us were really not the full picture of who we were as African Americans and what our lives were. So I knew that growing up. And I also understood that because I lived in Memphis, Tennessee, which, as many of you may know, is the place where Martin Luther King was his final campaign and was assassinated. So it's very much a part of the history. And when I was a teenager, when a lot of this stuff was going on, and I knew that that which was assumed that everybody else had as a citizen, we had to fight for still. That the civil rights movement was really about restoring our rights as citizens, which is kind of crazy if you're already supposed to be a citizen. And having had the honor of documenting and chronicling the stories of the people that went to the courts and to the streets to change the laws so that perhaps there'd be less questioning of our citizenship. One of the lines that we used in describing what the civil rights movement was about was to make America be America for all of its citizens. And that, for me, really says it all about what was the point of the civil rights movement, and also a very fundamental question that keeps going on, which is the assumption or the lack of assumption about my rights as a citizen. And it seems to me to be the continuing constant conversation about defending those rights all through my life. I see it now. I think it's important to realize that when we're talking about citizenship that, of course, there had to be a law to proclaim that African Americans were more than 3/4 of a person so that we could begin on the long road of being assumed to be citizens with all the rights and privileges of that. So that's very important, because once you start there, then you're always sort of working to get to the last fifth to make people understand where you are. So it really actually took an act of Congress to make that happen, and then it took all the folks who put their blood and bodies in the streets to make that change. I think about this because when we talk about what most people think are just the basic things that come with citizenship, being on a jury, voting, and even military service, all three of those activities, when it came to African Americans, this also applies to other persons of color, but I'm speaking out of my own experience, were always challenged. The folks that wanted to go to war, really, to stand up for their country, to say, I am a citizen and I want to fight for the country, from the Civil War on, had to explain, had to keep saying, we are citizens and we want to fight for our country, and it was always challenged. Well, you're not really, you don't want to really do it, and by the way, you probably are not skilled to do it. I think about the Tuskegee Airmen having to be an extraordinary team of World War II military folks in order to sort of begin to change some of those assumptions about who African Americans were and what about their citizenship rights when it came to serving in the military. Of course, we've talked about voting, and the folks on the bridge at Selma, they were already citizens. They were born in the country. So these are unarmed citizens being beaten to death for the right to register to vote. Just register to vote. I mean, this wasn't that long ago. So it's powerful to think about. And then when I think about the whole jury selection to having the ability, as you say now, to have the ability to be selected for a jury, I, of course, my mind turns to the Michael Slager case right now happening, the just mistrial. 11 of the people on that jury were white, 1 black person in a county which that did not reflect the population. If people don't know who Michael Slager is, he's a policeman in North Charleston, and he was caught on film shooting Walter Scott in the back 5 times. There is a dispute from him about what happened before that. He says there was a tussle with a taser, but the bottom line is the video has him shooting him in the back 5 times. And one of those jurors, we don't know who, said they couldn't assign guilt to him, even with as strong a picture as that, and also evidence that Michael Slager had misreported what happened on the report, and other people had backed it up until the videotape came forward. So, being able to be a part of a system, of a jury system in which you can be represented fully, and maybe it would have made a difference. I have to think that it would in that town to have had more folks of color on that panel, but it wasn't. So now it's a mistrial. We'll see what happens. And a man is dead while we're talking about this. So it's always about the assumption, and I appreciated your asking the question in the opening way about who gets to decide who a citizen is. I realize that as a journalist, we do shorthand. I know you won't be surprised by that. So I've interchangeably used the words citizen and resident. And that's just wrong because, of course, to be a citizen legally, you just have to live in the country where you are. But really to be a fully embraced citizen, you have to be more than that. It's not just about living in the space. It's about being able to do more and have the rights and concerns of that. And that's incorrect to do that. You have to be more than just your birthright, I think, to be a good citizen. And that's the question here, who is a good citizen? So I'm talking about people who have decided to take what was given to them by birth and do something with it for the common good, for the body politic that's outside of themselves. And I come from a long tradition of that, given who I am as an African American person. How do good citizens come to life, you asked the question. And I think they perhaps are always wanting to come to life, but need something to motivate them to become involved with what's happening. I think that what we've seen here now in as turbulent a time as this election has been, that there actually is more engagement by a number of people that may not have been engaged before. That people are really stopping to think, what does it mean for me not to be informed? What does it mean for me to be informed? What do I have to know? And by the way, what can I do in combination with other people to make some fundamental changes? And what we have seen in small groups everywhere, that change can happen. I like to think about Black Lives Matter now. They've been assailed as all kinds of things, from communists to radical terrorists. But in fact, what they are a group of citizens who've recognized that protest, and also using the power of unified protest targeted to communities, local communities. They're not really about the national thing, even though they get a lot of national attention. It's about the local community interaction is where it's happening, can make a difference. And I think that's what good citizenship looks like. And it also is what reflects the continuum of what African American work in the area of resistance, really, if you want to use that word, and striving to have more happen. So the question is about the assumption. I guess all of my career, the assumption has been that I am not who I am, even as when I show up for work. So then it becomes a larger question about, well, can you be who you are and get everything else that you should have automatically? That the things that Kay is talking about have happened to me too. Are you really here? Where are you from? How do you prove that you're here? It's always a matter of proving. There's never an assumption for, but an assumption against. I guess that's the best way for me to put it. And so I think right now, in these turbulent times, when we talk about how do we move forward, what is there to do, obviously being informed is good. Trying to teach other people how to assess what good information is good. But I also think that it means that everybody has to get their hands dirty. I mean, that's just what the bottom line is. Everybody has to get their hands dirty. That's where we are.
Thank you.
So I'm going to do I'm Michelle. So I'm going to do a little biography rant for just a few minutes and then offer maybe 3 provocative ideas for a conversation. So my biography is slightly different than the other panelists. My parents were both immigrants from Poland. They were Jews who left Poland in the 20s. And my mother was the youngest of 18. My dad was an orphan. And they sailed into New York Harbor. So when I see the Statue of Liberty, I still get teary-eyed. But they came to the United States at a moment that Karen Brodkin Sachs called when the Jews became white. It was a moment where our country was kind of organized around welcoming immigrants. My dad and mom worked very hard, but there was also a structure that was inviting particularly white immigrants into the economy, into the civic world, into the suburbs, into the military, into the post-military GI opportunities. So I was the baby girl in that family. So I always feel like this notion of citizenship is a disturbing notion. It's currently being used as a kind of battering ram by our president-elect to identify some people as deserving and some as not. So my comments really will try to trouble this idea and think less about citizen as a noun than the prepositions that follow that. That is, a citizen of what, for what, with whom, or against what, to use whether it's Black Lives Matter or the recent, knock wood maybe for a moment, victory in Dakota, where for those of you from out of town, Native Americans stood strong and sturdy and multiplied, and allies showed up to fight corporate power. And then the day before it was settled, hundreds of veterans, U.S. veterans, stood with those Native folks, again, to protect sacred lands and water. So I want to say that's citizenship to me. Right? That's what it means. It's a verb, not a noun. It's not a category of people. It's a commitment to put your life on the line for a project, I think, larger than yourself. Having said that, I think it's hard to think about what's a good citizen in times of spiking Islamophobia in this country and elsewhere. In times when, in this country at least, we're watching endless videos of Black men and women being shot by police with none or few being indicted, where we have a president-elect using the designation of citizenship as, I would say, a weapon of mass destruction. When children in schools are saying, "Bye, miss, I don't know if I'm coming back," and other children are chanting, "Build a wall" in Brooklyn, New York. When students at the College of Staten Island are getting flyers to join white nationalist organizations. When universities are hesitant to call themselves sanctuary sites these are hard times to call on young people or any of us to be good citizens when as a country we are so systematically destabilized. And I was just in England, and I have friends in Italy and in Germany and Austria, and these are not just local issues, these are global issues. But I worry about a kind of neoliberal focus on, are you a good citizen, when the world is, and our governments are so betraying Muslims, people of color, poor people, queer young people, undocumented immigrants. So if you think of citizenship as a relationship rather than a person, then I think we've got a bigger problem on our hands. So there's a reason people are asking, do Black Lives Matter? Because if you just watch TV, you just watch the videos, you would have to conclude no. If you watch the amazing activism, you would say it's vibrant, it's exciting, it's in solidarity with immigration groups, LGBTQ groups, feminist groups. So this is a hard moment to think through citizen, and so I don't really, I want to resist thinking about it as an individual characteristic. I want to tell you a research story. I think that's maybe the best way to get at this. In 2004, my friend Selçuk Şirin asked me to do research with him on Muslim Americans in New Jersey. And I said, no, I'm really the wrong person. You know, I'm Jewish, it just feels like a colonial project, as was said earlier, for me to do research on Muslim Americans. He said, come, you know how to do focus groups. So we did focus groups. And in New Jersey, as is true in the United States, Muslim Americans are, and were at that point, mostly as a minority group, middle class group. They're not, in this country, it's not an impoverished minority group. So prior to 9/11, a lot of these young people just thought they were like white kids in New Jersey, you know, wealthy white kids in New Jersey. And then after 9/11, suddenly there were new questions, just like the questions you were saying you're hearing this year about where are you from and do you belong and are you oppressed and are you a terrorist? So we had young people, we just gave them pieces of paper and magic markers, and we had them draw their many selves. And you can go online and see the images that they drew. Many of them drew beautiful rivers where Muslim swam into American. Those tended to be the young women. Some of them drew question marks over their head. Who am I and where do I belong? And one young man drew a picture with a jagged line down its face, and one side said Muslim and one side said American, and under Muslim there was a tear, and it said, this is the tear of racism. But I have to say, when we did this research in 2004, most of the kids said, you know, I'm Muslim, I'm American, I wear hijab. One little girl said, when I wear hijab, I tell people it's like wearing a bicycle helmet. It just gives me the strength to go wherever I would like to go, and it protects me. And then I heard that yesterday a woman with hijab was thrown down the steps at Grand Central in New York City. And another woman was attacked for wearing hijab in a cab after she left the White House in Washington, D.C. So we wrote about Muslim American young people as having what are called hyphenated identities. That is, they were Muslim and American, like African and American, like Latino and American. And at the hyphen, there's a lot of work. There's political work, there's personal work. One of the amazing things is friends of ours try to replicate this study in Denmark, in Germany, in Israel, and they didn't find that Muslims hyphenated their identity. You could be fourth generation Somali in Denmark, and you're Somali. And even I, who am pretty critical, had to admit something interesting happens in this country. Something interesting happens at that hyphen, right? There's the possibility that says you can be two things at once. And one of the things we found on the quantitative data was young people felt like they were very Muslim and very American. So for the clash of civilizations theory, that like if you feel very Muslim, you're not at all American, you're for Huntington's. So we didn't find that. We found very Muslim, very American. Except the more young people felt discriminated against, the less American they felt. So recently I've started doing work again with Muslim Americans. And it's a really different story. In 2004, they were a lot like the Japanese kids who were interned during World War II. They were young people who thought, I belong in this country. Oh my God, how come I'm going to how come I'm going to camps, right, when they were interned? And there was a librarian in San Diego who said to Japanese children in the 40s, send me postcards and I'll keep them. And you can go online and see the postcards, and they're very beautiful. I don't know, I don't really get it. I was playing hopscotch outside my house, and then all of a sudden I was told I had to pack up. And one little girl writes, I don't understand, how come the Japanese kids had to move, but the German kids didn't? So we started writing about Muslim Americans then as having hyphenated identities because they were exiled from the community they thought they were a part of. That is not the story of African Americans in this country. It is not the story of Latinos in this country. But it was the story of the Japanese Americans. It was the story of the Muslim Americans. Could become the story of the Jewish Americans, right? Karen Brodkin Sachs just wrote an essay the other day saying, maybe we're becoming off-white as we're now finding a rise of swastikas in New York City in front of the new school. So I say all that to say that recently when I've been interviewing Muslim American kids, I don't hear this hyphenated identity anymore. I'm hearing a sense of exclusion, a sense of betrayal. They sound a lot like the wonderful young African American young people I've spent 30 years hanging out with, like, this isn't really my country. This country doesn't really believe in me. What the amazing football player Colin Kaepernick, the position he took. And it's kind of astonishing to me that in 10 years we undermine the sense of civic commitment that a generation of Muslim American kids, and I'm only using them as an example, but a powerful, rich example, that we've undermined that with state betrayal of its own people. And I worry that we're on deck to see more and more, and I know we have long histories of state betrayal. So that takes me to my provocative, and then I'll shut up, okay? My 3 provocative questions. One is, what are all the ways in which we're all going to be complicit as they start picking off bodies? I'm already hearing people say, well, they're just going to come for the criminals. I do a lot of work in prison, so I don't even like that. But really, right? So the DACA kids will be okay, don't worry. So we're getting this like scaffolding of innocence, right? Who's the real worthy one that's worth fighting for? And what are the ways in which we are all going to be called upon to be complicit? And how can we, in the language of Maxine Greene, remain wide awake and resist kind of the banality of evil, to borrow from Hannah Arendt? The second is, as state violence perforates citizenship, how do we all create in our local spaces, in our universities, in our mosques and church and synagogues, how do we create spaces where we remember our common commitments? Everybody's going in their own corner, so white people are really acting out, but black people are really mad and Muslims are over here. And how can we create spaces where we dare to come together, even though we understand that at the moment we're very divided? And the third is, how do we really call on our universities? How do we call on them to step it up, to be sanctuary spaces, to take off, for instance, undocumented status? At CUNY, it's on it's on the students' records. So a lot of the universities have said, you know, we won't give it up, but if we get a subpoena, well, then scrape the records, right? What would happen if universities decided, actually, Harvard, you should pay taxes? Right? That there are questions that need to be addressed for what does it mean to be a good institutional citizen, and not just focusing on individuals. I will stop. Thank you.
So this was fascinating. I really appreciate it, and I'm going to ask you a question that I did not prepare any of you for with the questions I sent out based on what I heard. And this is actually in relation to a conversation I had with 2 of our master's students a few hours ago. So I, at an Askwith forum, actually in October, on education and the election, one of our students asked about American exceptionalism, and we had an exchange there about American exceptionalism. I ran into her today a few hours ago, and we were talking, revisiting the question of American exceptionalism post the election. And we got into a conversation about the extent to which we see our civic obligations now in the post-election era. All three of us, the two students and I, are strongly opposed to Trump. I'll put that out there. How much do we see our civic obligations now as resting within the United States versus, in some ways, recognizing our privileges as American citizens, right, which are on a global stage still enormous, right, perhaps in some ways greater than ever, right, and reorient globally. We were, and I'll give a slight bit of context to this because it relates to the issues of identity that all three of you brought up in the US context. So we were discussing the fact that I have been quite angry about the ways in which those who voted for Trump are being characterized in many ways as not voting for racism or sexism or xenophobia. They were voting for because they thought that he will bring a business sensibility, whatever. And I've been saying, I don't see how you can claim to vote for Trump and not be voting for racism. And I don't remember if it was my husband or somebody else who said, well, Meira, you know, my sister does work on national security and national data. He said, you know that Obama, before the 2012 election, was ordering drone strikes that engaged in the unauthorized extrajudicial killing of people abroad, both non-citizens and actually US citizens living abroad. And yet you voted enthusiastically for President Obama, for somebody who you know has directly ordered the extrajudicial killing of hundreds, if not thousands, of people around the world. But you say that you voted for him despite that, not because of that. And so we're talking about this question, and we were discussing the ways in which President Trump is likely to change the American culture in some ways, to highlight things that had been more latent in U.S. culture, to bring them back up to the fore, et cetera. And they both said to me, they're both African American, and they said, you know, I was saying I wasn't sure how I would compare changing the U.S. culture to extrajudicial killings. And they said, well, but remember that through changing the U.S. culture, that is going to, in fact, also increase the extrajudicial killings of people of color in the United States, right? As we've seen through, say, the killing of especially young black men and older black men and black women and so forth around the country. So they said, as one of them is a parent, she said as the parent of a young son, as the wife of a husband who is also African American, I worry, right? If my husband is pulled aside for a traffic stop, will he come home? So yes, we care about extrajudicial killings too, but we're going to orient, and we also care about U.S. Culture, and so we will orient here. Right now, we feel this sense of terror here, and that's where we're going to orient ourselves. And that got me thinking about the extent to which we sort of hunker down when we feel as if we're in a time of political crisis, and orient inside our country, and the extent to which we orient globally, and the ways in which it's a privilege of mine as a white woman who is also a citizen of the United States, both to be orienting inside and orienting out. And so all three of you, in certain ways, focused on what's going on here in the United States and your roles within it and what we think. I'm curious, how do you think about the roles of a good citizen, whether that's as an individual or as a relationship or as a collective, in these turbulent times, looking inside the United States versus looking globally and working globally?
The reason I'm hesitating is because I think right now for a lot of people hanging on, this is going to sound so small, but it has meaning. Who is going to be the Secretary of State? I really hate to start there, but that's going to say a lot about what happens to the country in its orientation globally. And it sounds small when we realize that we are really a part of so much more globally. But if we internalize some of the stuff, or whomever that person is, some of the stuff that's been swirling around here externally, that's definitely going to reorient what's happening inside the country as well. So I have to say that I'm quite concerned about what that's going to be, what the message is to the rest of the world. And it's not just the person, it's also how much will the person bring to our president-elect, what will happen there. So that's the first thing, as I think about that. I think it's very important to name things. We've talked about naming your group, moving away from feeling the intersection and then now feeling this. Mm-hmm. And so maybe what we've been doing is using all the euphemisms. So that's allowed us to despite and then make certain kinds of decisions. So if we name things, I think that'll go a long way to being sort of upfront about where we are. I guess what I'm struggling around is right now, if you think about it, because you mentioned veterans, and I thought about the weight of veterans, or in this country right now, they're like the best citizens. Doesn't matter who they are, doesn't matter what they may or may not done. We don't know their personal history, but the leading question is thank you for your service. They're if you think about it, the only body of people that, small thing again, can board the planes early, and because it's presumed that what they stand for is the best of America, and that's what we want to export elsewhere. So the power of that group to come to Standing Rock is really amazing. That's some shifting tectonic plates, perhaps. Amazing. And I mention that because in the same context, what happened to Colin Kaepernick, as you mentioned him as well, this is a young man who's refusing to stand for the singing of the national anthem. He goes down on one knee, and he says this is in protest of the killings of black men. Some veterans came forward, but there was a dispute in the group. It wasn't wholesale support. Exactly. And because of that, I think that what he was trying to say and his effort sort of got misconstrued. So I guess what I'm saying is that as long as we are still in kind of a very parochial space about who we believe are the best people and how we feel about that, we're in a big mess right now. We're not as expansive as we have to be to be a part of to be a global citizen. We're not ready. That's what I'm saying. We're really not ready. Mm-hmm. And so what you've asked of the conversation that you had with your students highlights this in so many ways. And it also scares me because I think if there isn't a lot of activity among all of us here on the ground, then we're going to get more and more insular. If we are not naming it, if we are not being forthcoming with calling things as they must be, then not only are we not good citizens, then we end up with a whole country of people who are not good citizens.
Michelle, you look like you have thoughts.
I can fumble towards your question. So I was lucky enough to be in London during the election season from November 2nd to the 23rd. Some of my friends were here. So it was curious to be there because people there were as scared about our election as we were. And they wanted to make sure that I voted, and then had to explain the Electoral College. And finally, I just said, I don't know, I think it has something to do with slavery. I get it. And so my provisional response of what to do now, I feel like I have 3 contradictory commitments beyond hiding and drinking. kind of, again, like as a white person who doesn't quite know where I belong, I don't know what my community is, and the community that people have designated for me, whether it's American Jewry or Israel, are not spaces with which, they're spaces I have a lot of critique of, even though I feel very culturally Jewish. So I feel like it's very important to hold open solidarity spaces, locally and transnationally. So we've been talking about what would it mean to really get activists and researchers and journalists together from the UK, I'm looking at my UK friends, and South Africa and Brazil and the US to kind of build, we do participatory community-based research, kind of democratic knowledge production, to kind of build the muscle of democratic work in solidarity, particularly as universities get more kind of fetishizing of science and big grant, whatever. So solidarity work both on the ground and international. I don't think they're incompatible. I think they actually feed each other. When I was at the Institute for Maori Studies in New Zealand, I got to see the power of global indigenous movements, where indigenous groups from New Zealand and the US and Togo and Australia we're kind of connecting. I see international LGBTQ groups. And when I saw young people from Palestine working with young people from Ferguson, it seems to me something very powerful is possible across place as well as within. So that's the first. The second is I think this is really a time for all of us to be checking our privilege, whether it's white privilege or education privilege or money privilege or Jewish privilege, and calling out our own groups quietly, publicly, however you want to do it. But we got work to do. I mean, my partner and I are quite involved with Jewish Voices for Peace, calling out what's happening in the name of a set of values that I thought were Jewish values, about justice and commitment and solidarity and labor and Palestine. So I think it's time for us to be doing some internal work. And I know it's not easy, and I know half of you now hate me, but whatever. I think we need to do that. And the last thing is to ask hard questions. Like, I don't know when Muhammad Ali became a good citizen. Like, all of a sudden, he died, and he became a good guy. So, when veterans accept one, then we know what they've done, and then we have a million questions, and they have a million questions. And so it's kind of interesting who we valorize, who we don't. Where are the dissenters? Where are the, where's Keith Ellison? Where are people that we want to say, that we want to honor, and how do we decide that some people are citizens only after they've been dead for a long time? So the only thing I got is the possibility of people coming together. And I have to say I've been very, very lucky. For 30 years, I feel like I've been able to be with very differently positioned folks and create good work. And I said that in Austria, and a woman said to me, so let me get this. You think you can get like Jews and Muslims and blacks and people in prison and everybody talking to each other and creating good research, and everybody basically ends up being socialist, feminist, and anti-racist. She said, in Austria, I think you get people together and they become Nazis and fascists. So it's like forced me to think about how much of my assumptions are either a little nutty, or do I have good taste in who we invite into the room? But I feel like we're losing that memory, that capacity of what it has been like to do work together, and it's the only thing I feel like is worth doing now.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you a question, Kay, and as I do it, I'm going to invite those who have questions to start coming up to the microphone, because we'll start taking people's questions in just a minute. We've heard Michelle just now talk about the sort of deep, on-the-ground, long-term work that she does with young people and others across difference. You are the director of an organization that probably has it's certainly the center in the United States of research knowledge about young people as citizens and civic actors, writ large. What do you know? What have you found recently about how youth are thinking about their citizenship and enacting it?
Yeah, and I think, when I think about you all's response, and then, you acknowledged how difficult it is, and I think what I'm starting to see is that young people are losing faith in institutions, and they're, both in positive ways, innovating how we make change happen. And that's through, non-voting. It can be activism, it can be community engagement, it could be so much enterprise. At the same time, sort of the foundation of what I think is really the core of citizenship, which is relational. I do believe that. And yet, we have been living in separate neighborhoods, different zip codes, and depending on where you're from, you no longer really connect. And that's why I said, emphasize the direct ties with people that are different from you, that come from different places. And those are increasingly lost. So whoever goes to college, goes to college. They were always going to go to college. Whoever was not going to go to college because of where they're from are never going to go to college and make living wage. And that has real implications on how we relate to each other, how we really understand each other. And without that, I think we have a really hard time building those solidarity spaces. I feel like there's a long-term goal is to sort of reverse that sort of a core of citizenship, how we relate. But it's not something that we can suddenly say, here you go, we open up a space in the community, we're going to come together, and the young people are certainly not going to come to that. And that's partly because of the fabric being really torn right now.
On that depressing note, let's turn to questions. And Matt, let's start with you. Oh, and before he starts, I'm going to say we really want questions. We are not looking for speeches or statements. I will be ruthless in cutting you off if I think that you are opining as opposed to questioning. Go for it.
All right. Do I need to say my name?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so I'm Matthew Shaw, Vanderbilt University, and I will ask a question, I believe it interrogatory. Does a good citizen have an obligation to understand, if not center, the perspective of citizenship in the experiences of people whose marginalization has been consistent and hasn't changed because of the global shifts that we're experiencing now?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Should we just vote?
Yeah, I definitely
Yeah.
believe that. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, how do you get to the conversation she's having if we're not on the same plane that she suggests that we have, that young people need to have? You have to me. That's the only way you can have a conversation that's meaningful.
At the same time, I think it's really hard to sort of ask people that are so fearful and hunkering down to sort of look outward and sort of get over that and not be so complicit, because that's sort of part of the problem, right? We're reinforcing the structure and the marginalization and disempowerment because we agree in principle that we should do something about it. But because we're so fearful, we're, by and large, not doing much about it. So something needs to shift. I think status quo is not okay for me. Of course, I agree, but clearly we're not doing something together. And so maybe Black Lives Matter is one example where people started to really decide to do something together. But that decision and how to make people make that decision, I don't know.
So what, when we do these critical participatory action research projects, whether it's in the Bronx on aggressive policing or across school districts with young people who go to desegregated schools, we create what we call contact zones, very differently situated young people doing research together, right? So, and the presumption is everybody brings a kind of expertise, and the question tips toward the perspective of the most marginalized position in the room, but it doesn't presume that person has truth and the other person doesn't. And we spend a long time at what we call a research camp, like figuring out how do we all see the world? You know, what music you're listening to? What's your experience with police? Let's go out together and watch how police are treating each other. And I think there's something very interesting about starting with a question rather than an answer. I mean, I've done organizing work too, but critical PAR, participatory action research, where you start with a question, it's interesting to watch privileged kids say, wow, I thought they were exaggerating. Or, you know, to walk through 12 different racially integrated high schools in New Jersey and New York and see the same top track white kids and a couple of black kids, same middle track mix, the same bottom track poor black, and to say this isn't a coincidence. And so There's something about organizing it around research that actually takes, I think, the heat or the defensiveness off, particularly the privileged folks, to be able to interrogate a question that challenges the benefits that they think that they've earned. But yes, I think tipping toward the most marginalized has to be a part of that.
I think what's really important, though, and I spend a lot of time on this, I guess there just has to continue to be folks like myself who will continue to do it, because a lot of people in those marginalized communities will just flat out say, I'm tired of teaching.
Yeah.
Stop denying my lived
Yeah,
experience.
exactly.
So, you want to at least be able to open the conversation where people will understand, if they don't,
It's true.
yeah,
It's really true.
get
Yep.
your lived experience. But that really is
It's
the
a
key.
full-time job.
You
It's
know.
not, doesn't pay well.
Why? Right. And not at all.
No.
And you get flack from it in hate
Yeah.
mail.
Thank you. Over here.
Thanks.
Thanks. I'm Jed Schwartz. I'm from Somerville, and I was wondering if the panel can agree around the idea that the underlying problem is that all of the educational groups are fighting over a diminishing reward pie. That the budget for education is getting challenged and reduced wherever possible. And that's partly caused, I would question, I've raised the question that it's caused by global corporatization, which is destroying jobs, and there doesn't seem to be any recognition on the part of the powers that be that if the jobs are destroyed, it's the obligation of the government to tax those who are, laughing all the way to the bank or the offshore tax haven, and withholding their taxes, and so the government is turning out their poverty-stricken, can't afford
All right,
to subsidize.
I'm going to be great.
I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Terrific. So, yeah, Michelle, you had talked about neoliberalization earlier. Do
Yeah.
you want to start with this?
Yeah, I probably, you and I should go out for a glass of wine, and I think we'd agree on a lot of things. The only thing I would disagree on is, the government's not without money. They're investing heavily in the military. They're investing heavily in policing. They're investing heavily in prisons. So and it raises this question in citizenship of, do we have a fantasy of the good state? Because right now, a lot of the communities I'm hanging out in, the state is only a punishing state, right? Which breaks my heart. I left the University of Pennsylvania to go to CUNY, a public university, because I had a little girl belief that there was a good state and that we would invest in that. So I think it's a redistribution of state monies and a kind of braiding of private corporate interests and public institutions, which actually makes it difficult to defend public institutions when they're representing corporate interests. And education becomes a place where I think that's a big fight.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say what scares me, and we're now in a post-factual situation, as everybody has said, is that a lot of people don't understand what you just proposed. So if you begin with the fact that people don't understand that's what's happening, and so has our educational system already failed us, or there's whole groups of people who really are believing something completely different from what is happening? So I don't know how you move from that. I mean, that's concerning to me.
Do you see, sort of drawing on that, so there's the good state and whether or not there's a vision of a good state or not, and then in terms of civic education, as we try to educate good citizens, should we be trying to educate them sort of to embrace the state and get the state to move in the way that we want them to move? Or should we be trying to sort of recognizing, say, in many cases, their suspicion of the state, whether on the right or the left, whether in the United States or abroad, and thinking about educating for civil society or for resistance or other kinds of work?
Yeah, I think whenever we educate as a society, we're dealing with people that are on the wrong side of whatever the state and sort of whoever is benefiting. So I think it's critical to then think about how do we educate and equip the young people with tool to really question what they believe is true. So then I think we start to have conversations that are more full of perspectives, alternative explanations. Then I think we start to move toward what's collectively right for the greater good. That's at least what I believe about people, is that once you start asking critical questions and questioning themselves, they'll start to shift toward solutions that are better for more people.
I believe that too.
Yeah.
Don't go to Austria.
Right.
Right. But, what sort of, you talked about institutional responsibility and
Yeah.
citizenship, and that's something that's really hard to separate from how we start to operate the educational systems, right? So while somebody like me might think it's about just using the budget creatively, move the STEM budget to integrate the civic education, we can do that. But that's not what people want. People like to get their piece of pie and go home with that. So how do we sort of promote that sort of collective good as a societal value isn't going to easily happen when we're all scared.
Can I just add one little thing?
Yes.
It scares me no end that my most interesting radical students of all racial and ethnic groups are like, get the state out of my business. Get the cops out, the schools, I don't need that social worker coming to my house. And they sound like the most conservative Republican. That there's a place where the kind of anarchist, social critique, libertarian positions are very, very close. And so, and I desperately say things, what about libraries? What about highways? What about CUNY? What about, but I do feel like we need to resurrect an image of a good non-racist state, because, or collective, or public, or, because I think people have so had, I live in New Jersey. We've also had it with corruption that it's like, why would you pay taxes? And so it feels like we're at a critical moment now where the right and the left are both kind of disbelieving in government. And we're on for the big show now.
All right. Why don't we take 2 questions, and then we'll get some responses.
Well, as you say, it will be interesting to see who the next Secretary of State is. Hopefully someone not like Hillary Clinton, who supported the bombings of Libya and Yemen and Gaza, was behind the war in Iraq, who's behind the sanctions on Iraq, the genocidal sanctions. So you're all anti-Trump, fine. But how can a good citizen in moral conscience support a mass murderer and war criminal like Hillary Clinton?
Okay, great. That's one question. And our second question.
So if we're seeing sort of some increased geographic segregation of worldviews, how much can we do if we want to be sort of active, progressive citizens without physically moving ourselves and doing things in other communities?
And I'd ask, why not?
Yeah.
But as in, like, is that now a condition of citizenship, that we just move to other communities?
I don't believe that, but at the same time, I think it's really easy to sort of go with the self-interest. When I am a parent too, and I think about my kids, and of course, it sounds kind of attractive to go to a high-performing, quote, quote, school district. But if we all make that choice to say, it's about my kid and my family and my economic well-being, we sort of break that social fabric of sort of just wanting to know about other people that are not like you. And by selecting where you live, what you do in your free time, and who you decide to associate with, what club you go to, you're starting to really silo yourself so that you are sort of complicit in maintaining the social order. So I think that's why I sort of really ask everybody, are you sure? Are we sure we're really not just reinforcing the privilege that we have? Are we not really desperately protecting that on our own? So I'm not telling you to move, but I think there are other ways in which we can break that.
Well, I think also that one of the advantages of privilege, so now you've acknowledged your privilege, is to know that you can break that holistic outlook and the way that you're living now. So one piece of your life may be, I don't do this, I do something different. I put myself in a place with other people who are certain to have different perspectives from me. I seek out the other information. I'm always talking to people about media literacy and the fact that you cannot be media illiterate with one source. I don't care how great you think that source is, you simply can't be. And guess what? You can't even be media literate with one source, 2 sources that all say the same thing. You have got to go someplace else and see where your assumptions are completely looked at differently by people who are coming at it in a different perspective. That's an informed citizen. That's a media literate person. So I think if you do that about all aspects of your life, I would have to say for myself, I would probably say that I have a more expansive circle than a lot of people I know. That is intentional. So have we used the word intentional? It really, if we're talking about being good citizens, one must be intentional. And that means you decide, I'm not going to be this, I'm going to do that, and I'm going to expand in this way, and then you make it happen. And that is an advantage of having a privilege to A, understand that, and B, be able to exercise it.
I'm going to go to 2 more questions, but I actually want to come back to the question that the person over here asked, right? So many young people and many citizens face choices, right, multiple choices that they view as bad, that they view as evil. How do we navigate, civically, when we see our choices as not just being unfortunate, but as embodying evil?
Well, I think that's what civic participation is all about, actually. As if that's what you believe and you have some evidence of that for your life, then you've got to get some other people along with you. I mean, we were just talking about the Native Americans as Standing Rock. They said it was more than just about a pipeline coming in.
Yep.
It was about a destruction of sacred grounds. It was also about water, not just for them, speaking of outside of your own, but 10 million other people on the Missouri River. Yeah. So somebody has to say, somebody has to gather together, somebody has to convince other people. That's how movements get started. A moment becomes a movement when you determine that I feel that something is so detrimental, or that others must know this, and I've got to bring you in with me. And we have to somehow figure out together how we're going to respond. So I think the least response is just saying, oh my God, that's so evil. And that's it. You really have to do something about it.
Thank you. Our next 2 questions.
Thank you. I'm curious, when did you become better citizens? When did you become good citizens? And when do you think one starts to be a good citizen? From what age? And I'm also curious, what initiatives give you hope? Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question.
I just finished a book by a sociologist who wanted to bridge the empathy gap and went to talk to Tea Partiers and make friends with them in Louisiana, specifically.
Yeah.
And she drew, it's very eye-opening. It's Strangers in Their Own Land by Arlie Hochschild.
Okay.
But it's very eye-opening. But what struck me was 2 things. One is in Louisiana, at least, there really isn't much democracy. So even they have corporations that are looked at as saviors to them, and they blame the federal government for everything and that. But they're immersed, and so they don't really. They try to change things when there's pollution, and then it gets undermined by the local officials that are too slow, purposefully slow, and on and on. So that's one thing. They're not having the experience of democracy. We've got authoritarian areas of the country, so they don't really understand. That's one. What's the so what do you do? What do we do about that? The Yankees go down there again and invade. That's what they really hate. The second one is they're immersed in an environment where the pulpits, the government, their party, the Republican Party, the media, Fox News Channel, tells them these stories about who to blame. And it's those immigrants, those refugees, those minorities, and the federal government. And so you've got this bubble. How do we deal with that? And I'm just curious about your opinions. Thank you.
So maybe,
Go ahead. No, you first.
So I do believe that there's no such thing as perfectly good citizen. So some days I feel like I'm a good citizen. Some days I feel like a terrible citizen. And when I sort of keep getting the news about who's been appointed and what's proposed, and I find myself almost giving up on it, just not reacting with outrage every time I think it's a terrible choice or whatever, just a more personal opinion. But I think sort of just not keeping up with it and not doing that makes me bad citizen. But at the same time, I think not having a job that's related to citizenship or public service doesn't define a bad citizen either. We met through research, young people who may not have a job, who may not have gone to college, who may work in retail, who may work in gambling, casino, but we're doing amazing acts of citizenship in their personal life. So I think we really need to think in sort of multiple ways in which people are different and nuanced in the way they think of themselves citizens. So that's that. I think when I think about sort of the authoritarian area where citizens simply don't seem to have any power, part of the problem that we see in the youth engagement research is actually sort of this enormous gap between presidential voting, kind of outreach that happens, and media coverage about the candidates, what happens in the midterm, local, and mayoral elections. It's a huge gap. It's so outrageous that you think, did we tell you not to vote? If 10% of the youth population is voting in mayoral elections, then no wonder there's no accountability. We do need to change that. And part of it is about teaching in schools, but it's also about evening out the media coverage and not think about candidate as this cast of characters that come in and out, but it's about the policies and ideologies that are represented by those candidates. So that's one.
So I think about going to the polls with my parents when I was small. They waited deliberately till the end of the day because when we would go, everybody from our neighborhood would be there, all the working people. And it was for my sister and me a big party, but also to see this is what you do. This is important. And of course, we had the layer of history on top of that as well. So for me, I understood early on that I didn't have the luxury of not doing certain things, that I had to aspire to certain things and be sure that I was doing my part to hold up my citizenship contract, because African Americans for so long have been, citizens in name only. So my job was to make sure that that didn't happen and keep pushing forward. Now, having said that, my sister had twin children, so I didn't have to have anything, thank God. And she used to tell me when they were small, everything is not a teaching moment, because I would just launch into and the history and everything's not a teaching moment. So I think that for my role as an adult, as a good citizen, is got to figure out how to use my platforms in every arena of my life to sort of bring other people into to wanting to do this, to wanting to see the worth of participatory civic engagement. And if I can demonstrate that, talk about it, do whatever, then that's what I do. That's how I try to be a good citizen. I think I fall down on the job often, as you do, but that's what I try to do. As to Louisiana, half of my family comes from Louisiana. I am real aware of Louisiana. As my cousin used to say, when I used to ask him why they kept re-electing a certain really crooked politician, he said, we like our politicians, our crooks honest. Okay, that's Louisiana. So, but I like to go wherever the hardest places are and see, is there any one little light? From the beginning of Louisiana, there is a fusion happening. There is a coming together around food. All these different people brought their histories to make this fabulous food, and they still are there making their fabulous food. So all of these various folks contribute to this sort of melting pot of engagement around food in Louisiana. I gotta figure somewhere with that, there may be a way to sort of crack what seems to be really horrible otherwise, politically and socially. And believe me, I know, I'm there a lot. As just a way. So maybe it takes energy, a different perspective, an outside look that I haven't seen, but I do know that there is some coming together in a very important industry in Louisiana, and that's the food.
I would just give Should we go back to another question?
Well,
Let's take questions. I don't need to.
Okay,
They do
all
great.
right. Can we just hear the briefest possible? Give us your nugget of a question, the three of you, and then I'll let our three panelists give whatever their
That's
last
good.
thoughts are. Go for it.
So I've heard a wonderful term, which is civic engagement. I hear different definitions. I don't see those in power as having anything to do with citizens unless we fund them. And that is, we're either defined as consumers or we're defined as an electorate. An electorate is different than a citizen, is what I'm understanding. And from that perspective, I deal with narrative. I'm trying to understand how you can have citizens if there is no shared narrative, if there's no shared story, and your voice is not valued as part of it. So I guess my question, and I must say that after September 11th, we were a victim of an arson attack on our place of worship north of Syracuse, the first such attack on a place of worship. As Sikhs, they thought we were followers of bin Laden, thought these 4 kids were doing their patriotic duty. We immediately went public with a very powerful statement of forgiveness, which galvanized the entire community and transformed these kids' lives. So the issue is, we in schools don't teach civics anymore. Even the Maxwell School of Citizenship, of which my dear friend, so the kernel is citizenship being defined by a political or a consumer people in power, or is citizenship engaged interaction, which I would say then can and should and must be taught?
Great, thank you. I'm going to cut you off there and head on here.
Sure. Working in education with young students of color and other oppressed students, how do we build solidarity spaces and safe environments when they, at the current political moment, feel betrayed by the state and are targets of state violence?
Thank you. And our last question.
Hi. Well, as you may know, Mexico had been in a war for 10 years against drugs, drug dealer, narco traffic. And I don't know if I'm misinformed, but I had never really seen the work of the citizens, the American citizens, like taking the responsibility of reducing your drug consumption, not only in terms of public health, but because Mexican lives matter. So I would like to know if that is already in your agenda of being a good citizen, or it's just too far away. Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
That was great.
We have 3 really powerful questions. You get to choose one and give an incredibly superficial answer because you have about 30 seconds each. Or you may just give a closing statement of about 30 seconds.
Wow. I don't know if it's going to answer anything, but I want to end with a good story. Is that all right?
Yes.
That Mexico question's a really good one. No, I will think about it. We have a large participatory project with LGBTQ youth of color who are overrepresented in homelessness and foster care and juvenile justice, and almost all research on LGBTQ kids are kind of high-end white kids who are in gay-straight alliances. And so these funders asked us to do a PAR project, so we brought young people from all over the country together. And they probably don't look very citizen engaged, civically engaged. They are so profoundly civically engaged in their bellies. They are co-housing. They are sharing the little food they've got. They are the 2 young trans kids in Seattle who are being thrown out of their Korean homes because their parents are evangelical, are DACA students, and are so worried about their brothers and sisters. The trans kids, and there are 4 trans women from New Orleans who are beautiful and dedicated and smart, and out of unbelievable betrayal, they are filled with a sense of civic responsibility activism and chutzpah. You all know chutzpah? Like the courage to demand justice even when you haven't received any dignity from intimates and for me, they have just transformed my notions of A, what's civic engagement, but B, under what conditions does deep marginalization become a collective commitment to responsibility and justice? Because there are working class Black people in Louisiana who didn't respond the same way. So we've got to complicate these stories by race, by class, by region. And the last thing I'll say is I was in Tennessee just before the election at Highlander, and to the man who asked about Hillary. And I met a lot of white working class coal miners, former coal miners. They were not voting for Hillary for all the reasons that you said. And they didn't really want to vote for Trump. But they didn't feel like a Wall Street candidate was going to ever represent their interests. And somehow, this guy got them to believe, with all his billionaires, that he might. And I said, you know, what turns the despair to hatred, right? Because I'm hanging out with these young people, all my Black friends have good reason to, and it doesn't quite turn in the same, and what they said was, you know, you get despairing communities where the coal mines have lied to them for generations and generations. And then you get a couple of preachers in here who are happy to whip that right against Black people and immigrants and LGBT folks and undocumented folks, and will keep them from looking up at who's really to blame, at corporations and wealthy folks. And the combination of right-wing media and some religion, has kept people focusing on the hatred rather than the possibility of bringing together. And I say that to say I actually think we can create spaces where people can reimagine what's possible, but our work is cut out for us.
We are out of time. I'm really sorry to have a last teeny thing you want to say? Callie or Kay? Callie, and then Kay. Callie first.
I was just going to try to answer the questions. No to the Mexico thing, and yet there's more emphasis on understanding drugs and our part in it around the opioid crisis. So there's possibility there. Find community to the young woman who said she feels threatened. There are more communities developing now because people do understand the threat that's been brought forward. The narrative, the common narrative begins with where we live, because back to Kay's, it starts with our selfish needs, and so we build a common narrative where we are in community with our neighbors first, and then we broaden out to a wider narrative.
Model. Okay.
Okay, I'll try to be short. And sort of following up to Michelle's point, and also for young, I think, educator who asked about how do we create a space. I think there's a lot of hopes in really letting young people try on democracy. It doesn't have to be the national politics where we're moving policies and we're moving the government, but it can be about what do we do about this very, very relevant but small problem that we have together. And I think that's an opportunity for young people of all backgrounds and all belief systems to feel for once there is a hope. And I think we do have to show that. Even if the effort's ultimately unsuccessful, it's still a trial in practicing what it's like to be a citizen. And if we don't give that to all of the students, including in Tennessee and Louisiana and everywhere else, I think we're doing disservice to the country.
Great. Please join me first in thanking our three panelists, and then second at a reception across the street in the Gutman Conference Center, thanks to the Association for Moral Education. But first.